He didn't raise his voice. He never does. That is the thing about Shohei Ohtani that people who have only watched him from the outside sometimes fail to understand. The power he carries inside a baseball organization is not expressed through demands or ultimatums or the kind of theatrical leverage that lesser stars have used throughout the history of the sport. It doesn't arrive with an agent's phone call at midnight or a leaked story planted carefully in the right publication to apply the right pressure at the right moment. It arrives quietly. Deliberately. In the form of a conversation that the other side of the table treats with the kind of attention that only gets paid to men who have earned the right to be heard at that level. Ohtani had a conversation. And when it was over, two Dodgers were no longer Dodgers. That is how much has changed since the day he signed in Los Angeles. That is how completely the architecture of power inside that organization has been reshaped by the presence of one man whose ability to influence outcomes extends far beyond what happens between the white lines on a baseball field. The request was accepted. And now Roki, Sasaki and Dalton rushing are headed somewhere else. To understand what just happened, you have to start in a place that most people haven't thought about carefully enough. There are franchises in professional baseball where a superstar's opinion about roster construction is welcomed, respected, and then quietly set aside while the adults in the room make the actual decisions. The player is thanked for his input. His perspective is filed somewhere. And then the front office does what front offices have always done, weighs the contracts, calculates the service time, models the projections, and arrives at a conclusion that has very little to do with what the man on the mound actually said he wanted. The Dodgers are not that franchise. Not anymore. Possibly not for a long time. When Ohtani speaks about the roster, when he makes clear, in whatever quiet and deliberate way he makes things clear, people inside that building listen with a different quality of attention. Not because they are afraid of him. Not because his contract gives him veto power over personnel decisions in any formal or contractual sense. But because they have watched what happens when Ohtani is aligned with a situation versus when he is not. They have seen the difference between a fully engaged Shohei Ohtani and a Shohei Ohtani who is merely going through the motions of cooperation. And that difference, measured in wins and losses and October outcomes and the billion-dollar machinery that surrounds all of it, is not a difference any rational organization would choose to ignore. So when the conversation happened, when Ohtani's position on Roki, Sasaki and Dalton rushing became known internally, the front office did not file it away. They acted. Roki Sasaki arrived in Los Angeles carrying the weight of enormous expectation. He was not just a pitching prospect. He was a specific kind of prospect, the kind that organizations build narratives around before he has thrown a single professional pitch on American soil. The kind whose name appears in conversations about rotations and playoff matchups and long-term competitive windows before any of those things have had the chance to become real. He was, in the language of baseball optimism, the future arriving early. The reality of his time with the Dodgers was more complicated than the narrative suggested. That is almost always how it goes. The gap between what a prospect represents in theory and what he produces in practice is the space where baseball organizations spend most of their emotional energy. Sasaki was talented. No serious person disputed that. The arm was real. The repertoire was real. The potential, measured by anyone willing to look at it honestly, remained genuine even when the results on the field told a more uncertain story. But potential and fit are two different things. And somewhere inside the Dodgers organization, inside the specific calculations that go into building a pitching staff around a two-way player who requires a level of structural accommodation that no other player in the sport demands, a conclusion was reached about Roki Sasaki's place in the long-term picture. That conclusion, it appears, was influenced significantly by what Ohtani said in that conversation. Not because Ohtani wanted Sasaki gone for personal reasons. Baseball is rarely that simple, and Ohtani is rarely that petty. But because the question of how a pitching staff is constructed around a man who both pitches and bats is not an abstract organizational question. It is a practical, day-to-day, game plan level question that the person at the center of it experiences more directly than anyone else in the building. When Ohtani spoke about what he needed, about what the structure around him needed to look like in order for all of it to work the way the Dodgers needed it to work, Sasaki's name apparently fell on the wrong side of that equation. Dalton Rushing's situation carried a different kind of weight. Where Sasaki's departure is about pitching staff architecture and rotation construction and the complex mathematics of a two-way player's roster impact, Rushing's exit is about something more personal. More human. More connected to the kind of story that baseball produces when a young player's trajectory intersects with the specific gravity of a superstar's presence in ways that neither of them fully anticipated. Rushing had believed in himself. That much was always clear. The confidence was not manufactured, it was the genuine, sometimes uncomfortable confidence of a young player who had been told his entire career that his ceiling was very high, and who had internalized that message deeply enough that the gap between his self-assessment and his current production didn't shake him the way it might have shaken someone with less certainty about where they were going. But the Dodgers needed to make a decision. And the decision they made did not include Dalton Rushing in the long-term picture. The 2-for-1 structure of the trade was not accidental. It was deliberate, the specific shape of a deal designed to solve a particular problem while acquiring a particular kind of return. Two players with real but unrealized value, packaged together to bring back something the Dodgers needed more urgently than either of the pieces they were giving away. When trades happen this way, when the math of the deal requires grouping two players together to reach the value of what's coming back, it says something about where each of those players stood in the organization's hierarchy of certainty. Not failures. Not players who had definitively proven they couldn't contribute at the major league level. But players whose futures inside this specific organization had become, in the front office's honest assessment, less certain than the present demanded. The trade was the answer to a question the Dodgers had been sitting with for several weeks. Ohtani's conversation was what finally moved them to answer it. Inside the clubhouse, the reaction was the specific kind of quiet that falls over a professional sports environment when something significant has shifted. Not grief, exactly. Baseball players understand roster movement in a way that civilian life rarely requires anyone to understand anything, as a constant, as a given, as the background noise of a career spent in a sport that treats humans as assets with fluctuating values and expiration dates. No one breaks down. No one makes a scene. The equipment gets packed. The handshakes happen. The locker gets cleared. But quiet is not nothing. Quiet in a clubhouse that has just lost two of its own is a specific kind of acknowledgement, the recognition, unspoken and shared, that what just happened was real and that the team standing here now is different from the team that stood here yesterday. Roberts addressed it. Briefly, in the way he addresses most things that require acknowledgement without requiring elaboration. He spoke about the players who were leaving with the respect that genuine respect produces, not the performed, organizational kind, but the acknowledgement of men who had been part of something and had conducted themselves in ways that deserved to be recognized on the way out. And then he looked forward. Because that is what the best managers do. They honor the past for exactly as long as the past deserves to be honored, and then they turn toward whatever is coming next. What was coming next, in this case, was the player arriving in the other direction. The piece coming back. The reason the 2-for-1 structure had been built the way it was built and accepted the way it was accepted. Ohtani's fingerprints on this moment are everywhere, even where his name doesn't appear directly. This is what happens when a player of his magnitude reaches a certain level of trust with an organization. The decisions stop being made in spite of his perspective and start being made in alignment with it. Not because he controls the front office, he doesn't, not formally, not on paper. But because the people who do control the front office have watched him operate closely enough to understand that what he sees from his position is not the same thing they see from theirs. He sees the game from the inside. From the mound, from the batter's box, from the specific vantage point of a man who experiences every roster decision as something that either makes his job more possible or more difficult. That perspective is not replaceable by any amount of analytical modeling. It is the kind of intelligence that only comes from being, on a daily basis, the most important player on a team that is trying to win a World Series. When Ohtani said what he said, the Dodgers listened because they have learned that listening to Ohtani, on matters like this, tends to produce better outcomes than not listening to him. The trade was the proof of that lesson applied in real time. Roki Sasaki will pitch somewhere else now. He will carry his arm and his potential to a new city, a new organization, a new set of expectations that may or may not align more cleanly with what he is actually able to produce on the field. Whether he becomes, somewhere else, the pitcher that everyone in Los Angeles hoped he would become here, that part of the story hasn't been written yet. Dalton rushing will chase his ceiling somewhere else too. With a fresh start, a new uniform, and the specific kind of motivation that departure from a place you believed in tends to produce in players who still have something left to prove. And the Dodgers will move forward. Reshaped. Recalibrated. Built a little more precisely around the man whose quiet conversation set all of this in motion. That is the nature of what Ohtani has become in Los Angeles. Not just a player. Not just a contract. Not just a number on a lineup card or a name on a pitching schedule. He is the axis around which everything else turns. Two players found that out this week in the most direct way possible. The trade was accepted. The jerseys were packed. And the Dodgers, as they always do, looked forward. Ohtani was already preparing for his next start.